It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Bleddyn Bowen, who is an international expert on space security, internationally recognized, internationally sought after. We're very happy to have him here today to present his new book. If you haven't seen it yet, it is on this side of the Atlantic now. And also we do have coupons out front when you get a discount if you would like to order the book. So Bleddyn is an associate professor of international relations. Like I said, expert on space security. This is his second book. And he's been going around town this week, talking with both government and non-government audiences. And now he's here with us today to present his ideas. So he's going to present, and then there's going to be time for Q&A afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. Thank you very much for organising today, and everyone at SBI. And thank you very much for the invitation to speak. And thank you all very much for coming here this afternoon. To listen to me ramble on about something that's about 400 pages or so here, that I'll try to condense into about 40, 45 minutes or so, or if you're lucky, even less. Original Sin is the new book, and it is hopefully going to be a book that is perhaps more accessible and broader in scope than my first book, which was based on my PhD thesis. And this book is designed for a much wider audience. At least that's the intention. I'll see if I've been successful or not in the years to come. So in terms of what I set out to do, one of the things I tried to do was to push a more global perspective of outer space and avoid yet another book, at least in the English language, that is centered on the United States. When it comes to looking at space from an international relations perspective, the United States is not particularly special. It doesn't have a unique claim to the heritage of outer space. It doesn't have the entire story of what we can call a truly global space age. So it's trying to put in a more global perspective into what we may think of as a space age, so a global space age. And then more substantively, try and make this very fundamental point to wider audiences. So for many people here, you already know this, you are in the space community, or at least the national security space community. I've lost my slides. I don't know what's happened there. Oh, they're back. Thank you. And yeah, so the point that space has always been militarized really since the start of the space age. As soon as humans started putting things into space, they have been of a military nature or a military dominated nature. So the history of space, as far as its practical use by humanity when machines were being put up there, it's been really a political and military history as well. It's not something that is dominated by just the pursuit of knowledge or scientific cooperation, as we seem to get from a lot of popular media narratives about outer space. So outside of our own national security or military or space politics circles, I mean, this point is still needs to be made to a lot of wider audiences, including at the United Nations. So hopefully the book is something that people who do politics and history or international relations in general can use to learn about space. So I hope it's something that people new to space, but are from the political world, can read and use. But also something that science, technology, engineering, and mathematics people, or maths as we call it on the other side of the pond, can use to learn about the politics and the history and the strategy and the security aspects of what they do in space as well. So I hope it's something that can be something of a bridge between those communities. And I hope that the book gets the big picture right enough for interested people, policymakers, and of course, students of international relations and of outer space. Now, there's a lot of global history and global politics in this book, and I hope that at least the big picture is right enough. And despite all the help from people who have helped review various parts of the book, including Aaron, who's very kind in reviewing many parts of the book, any mistakes in there are mine, but hopefully the big picture will be right enough. So in terms of the main arguments of the book, space technologies have not been inherently developed for the benefit of all humankind. Like any aspect of techno-political existence or the use of technology by humans, it's ambiguous in its nature. It's not something that is inherently good or universally good. And that is something that I think jars with a lot of perceptions of outer space, and particularly coming from popular science narratives about outer space. So like any other environments that humans use, the political impacts and the political rationales for them are quite mixed and not necessarily for the benefit of absolutely everyone. Selfish political motives are also part of the reason for why humans have developed space technologies. Second, we live in a global space age. It's not just for the biggest 2 or 3 powers of the international system at any given time. Even in the earliest days of the space age, it wasn't just something that was dominated by Nazi Germany in the 1930s or the Soviet Union and the United States in the immediate post-war era and the early Cold War. Many other people and places around the world were doing things with space and space technology and space science from the earliest days. So again, it's trying to have that more global perspective of space and plug in wider perspectives into the more common narratives that we might be used to about the Soviets and the Americans, especially in Cold War space history. And then finally, and those of you who suffered through reading my first book will be somewhat familiar with this final point, that Earth orbit will be a war zone if and when a major war does happen between space powers or the most advanced economies. However, concepts such as the ultimate high ground, I think, aren't the most useful to perhaps understand the potential and the varieties of space strategies and ways of doing space warfare can be used and can be thought of, and rather than being a high ground or a new ocean, as John F. Kennedy said in one of his big speeches, it's more of a coastal environment. It's defined by its proximity to Earth, and it's quite the useful parts of space really are below 40,000 kilometers altitude, and it resembles something more like a very busy coastal environment rather than a massive new expanse, which really is the purview of sci-fi, which is also called The Expanse, which I enjoy very much. So the book is organized into 3 parts, sort of along those lines. And part 1 explains what I mean by the title, Original Sin. So what is the original sin of space technology? Well, what it really refers to is the militarized origins of the space age. The space age, as we know it, would not have happened were it not for the very powerful military motivations behind developing those technologies, specifically for nuclear weapons delivery and the earliest spy satellites and communication satellite technologies. A lot of space science, commercial and civil space uses, especially in the United States, Soviet Union, Britain and France, followed from massive investments in these basic technologies in the 40s, 50s and 60s for ultimately military purposes and also competitive industrial technological purposes as well. So many of you are familiar probably with the history of the V2 rocket development in Germany in the 1930s. A lot of those experts were either fled Germany or were extradited from Germany at the end of World War II. And they ended up in many, many countries, not just the United States, but the Soviet Union and France, but also Argentina, Brazil, and Egypt, and India as well. The expertise ended up in many places. And of course, they were based on weapons technologies and also used slave labor to build and advance those technologies on a practical level as well. A particularly horrible statistic is that more people died building the V2 rockets in the Mittelwerk factory than were killed through their use as actual weapons. So it's estimated around 3,000 people were killed by the use of V2s as weapons. It's estimated that 20,000 slave laborers were killed in Mittelwerk building them. And Wernher von Braun, pictured here, of course, was ultimately responsible for that. And as historians tell us, he was aware of that. But moving on from World War II, we have so-called fathers of spaceflight. There are sort of national stories about the origins of rocket and satellite developments in many countries. Of course, in the United States, Robert Goddard and Wernher von Braun dominate, but in the Soviet Union, of course, there's Sergei Korolev. There's Chen Shushen, and I apologize if I'm mangling that name, of course, who led the early Chinese efforts in the 1950s and 60s, Vikram Sarabhai in India, and Hideo Itokawa in Japan, for example. However, it's worth noting that like any great man approach to history, these were just particular individuals in large government, industrial, and often military bureaucracies that were pouring in lots of people and lots of money into developing what were very experimental technologies in the 50s and the 60s. But these were all happening at the same time. As at the same time, the Soviets and the Americans were making very big advances in rocketry in the 50s and the 60s. India, Japan, Britain, and France, and China were putting in similar amounts of resources into mastering essential rocket technologies that they wanted for their own burgeoning nuclear weapons programs. So much of the global space age, as we know, it's happened because of the thermonuclear revolution, especially with the maturation of ICBM technologies and the development of fusion bombs by the late 1950s and the early 1960s. So inaccurate ICBMs armed with megaton yield fusion bombs meant that they were much better than aircraft delivered fission bombs. You didn't need to worry about accuracy. You could miss a city by a couple of miles, you'd still break it with a fusion bomb. And it put a new premium on missile technologies that were useful to a lot of these military services in these various countries and bureaucracies. And those investments put the technological foundation for a lot of other uses of space technologies that then came afterwards. So much of the story of the development of the earliest space technologies really is about military and industrial space technology. So in the US, USSR, UK, France, India, and Japan, they either had explicit or latent links to nuclear and missile industries. India and Japan are perhaps notable for not being as explicitly linked to nuclear and missile interests early on in their space launch vehicle development history, but the interests were there, particularly in India, in developing their first credible nuclear weapons delivery systems later on in the Cold War. And in Japan, there was particular interest in securing capabilities in strategic technologies and avoiding complete reliance on the United States in what they thought were essential technologies in the new Cold War world order. It is important to note as well that even Japan was considering, nuclear weapons options before the Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed in 1968. So even in the countries with more civilian-facing programs like India and Japan in the 60s, and those military interests and strategic latency ideas were there in the background, supporting a coalition of interests that supports any large technological program such as nuclear weapons, missiles. So this is really trying to show the much bigger global story of nuclear, missile, and space development happening in the same years as the common narratives we all know in terms of the space race of Sputnik and Gagarin and the earliest US and Soviet military space systems in the early 1960s. And it exemplifies really the dual-use nature of so much space technology that we hear so much about today. So there's no getting away from the overlaps between military technologies and their use in civilian sectors, but also the development of civilian space infrastructures that can be turned later on towards military capabilities as well. So the ballistic missile nuclear age was really fundamental to the development of space technologies. And as is well known, and in an area that is well explored by many US space historians, the International Geophysical Year, which is remembered by many space scientists as a leap forward in so much mapping and space technologies, it was very much a public cover for Eisenhower's spy satellite program as well. So the Soviet Union were happy to do this as well. So again, it's not uniquely American either. And I think it's worth pointing out that a lot of the proofs of concepts were moving in between civilian and military bureaucracies where you had them. So NASA cooperation with the Pentagon and the intelligence community in the US was very prevalent early on. And of course, in the Soviet Union, there was no real meaningful distinction between civil or non-military uses of space technologies and military uses. In smaller countries, again, that distinction was even less meaningful because they weren't doing things on the same scale as the two superpowers, but they were doing them. Interestingly, India and Japan, when developing their own rocket technologies, had quite a few different experiences. Japan was able to receive Thor rocket technology from the United States. The United States was quite alarmed with Japan's initial development of solid fuel rocket technologies, which are more useful for ballistic missiles than for space launch vehicles and satellite deployments. So it was hoped that providing Thor missile technology would allow the Japanese to move away from solid fuel rocket technology. Japan just learned a lot about liquid fuel technology and carried on developing solid fuel rocket technology. So when India asked America for Thor rocket technology, it was a flat no from the United States. We've learned from the Japanese experience. So, and what that also shows us, and what was interesting for me reading, doing the research for this book was, and this is a point made by people like John Krieger and Asif Siddiqui, it really punctures the national myths around the rocket technologies of any country, which like to show it in a very nationalistic, if not almost autarkic way, where we did this as a nation, showing our technological might. But in reality, what you get is a lot of cross-border flows of information, expertise, and technology. Different countries deciding to share or cooperate or leak certain things to each other. So you have that transnational flow of technologies throughout the space age, and different countries use what they can and cooperate where they need to, but then also develop things indigenously where they think they must as well. So that is one aspect of the original sin of space technology. It's basically business as usual in terms of politics and international relations are concerned. There's nothing special about outer space. But the other aspect, of course, is that the space age started in an era of decolonization in the Cold War as well, the collapse of the old imperial world order. Despite that, however, much of space infrastructure was built on that old imperial order as well. So many facilities, space facilities around the world, are built on territories acquired, gained, or seized by the imperial powers and sometimes held to this day. So French Guiana, for example, or the use of Diego Garcia, which the British cleared for the Americans, and then the Americans built a massive military facility there, which included ground facilities that supported crewed space flights later on in the 60s. But also the use of Woomera in Australia, which heavily disrupted Aboriginal life in those areas. The San Marcos project's impact on Malindi in Kenya, and also Baikonur in the Soviet Union. These were territories gained through empire practices of settler colonialism and other imperial aspects, and ties into what a lot of Cold War historians call nuclear imperialism as well. So the testing of nuclear weapons devices across the third world, across the decolonizing world, and including China with Xinjiang, for example. So again, many of the space powers were doing these things. So again, this is another global aspect of the space age, and another aspect of how space is not something that is apart from the more horrible aspects of human politics and terrestrial politics. And if we want to try and do better in space, we can't really do that if we ignore this very real history and the impact on perennially marginalized people, societies, cultures, etc. So our understanding of global space history cannot ignore the post-colonial and imperial aspects of that history if we want to do things better in the future. So that's the first part of the book, how everything got started in space, pretty much as carrying on with normal politics on Earth for good and bad. But part two then talks about the maturation of space technology. One of the phrases that tends to annoy me the most in the general policy discourse in space is how space is somehow an emergent issue, or space technology is emergent. I mean, how old is GPS now? 50 years old? The first satellite went up in 1977, if I remember correctly. 74. Well, there we are, it's 1974. So these technologies, are quite old, and what we're living with today are matured successive generations of quite old technologies whose concepts have been long proven. So everyone raves about GPS as an emerging security issue today. Well, no, there's decades of experience with GPS when it comes to the United States. And a lot of old concepts are new again when it comes to satellite and weapon systems in space. So there's a long history of what is called applied witchcraft in the intelligence community in the United States, using space to spy on other countries and gather information of all kinds. And the sheer diversity of the space systems are, of course, quite overwhelming to people new to space. So in the book, what I try to do is talk through these broad categories of capabilities, but using different examples from different countries as well. So the use of keyhole, I think, is very good for the United States, showing how satellite imagery could do things aerial reconnaissance through the use of the Blackbird or U-2 aircraft just couldn't do. It didn't make them obsolete necessarily, but it really provided new insight in terms of intelligence gathering on Earth. But things like signals intelligence and infrared sensors, these are still areas of old technological capabilities that a lot of modern warfare or intelligence analysts, journalists, or pundits just don't seem to know much about. So I hope for those of you who would just like to try and read this thing, if they're new to you, hopefully it'll be a good introduction to you on them, but also showing diverse examples of them as well. And then also I look at what I've loosely banded together under the term tethers of modernity. So a lot of the infrastructure that we now rely on today for what we could call a modern political economy, satellite communications, navigation, satellite systems, and increasingly monitoring the space environment. These things have also been developed by a number of countries. So a great example of early satellite communications and satellite TV is India's development of broadcast TV from space in cooperation with NASA in the SITE program, SITE, and how it was easier for India to develop satellite TV rather than terrestrial broadcast towers across the entire subcontinent. So sending small antennas and dishes into the many villages across the subcontinent, and then hooking them up to the village generators was much, much easier than building very large radio towers all across the place. So the idea of leapfrogging through space technology is sort of prevalent in some aspects there. But ideas or concepts like navigation technology has proven so popular that there are now 4 GNSS systems in space. So the US GPS, the Russian GLONASS, European Galileo, and China's Beijing. And you can start seeing political economic blocks developing around these systems because they are so useful for a multitude of civilian and military functions that modern states really cannot or do not want to live without. And space situational awareness is very much a global capability because from the earliest days, global space tracking sensors being built around the world. So the United States was, even by the late 1950s, setting up a space tracking site in South America. So the ground infrastructure is also really important in the story of the space age, and the down-to-earth manifestations of these technologies often get ignored by many people who want to just focus on the rockets and the satellites. With the SATCOMs, the GNSS, the ground stations, the peripherals, the consumer electronics are also very important parts of it. But what we're also seeing as well is a lot of weapons technology concepts that were popular in some parts of the Cold War coming back with a vengeance today, especially as relations sour between Russia, China, and the United States. One of my favorite capabilities in space is the infrared sensors or the ballistic missile early warning systems. And the American systems are SPIRS or SBIRS or DSP. And this is one of my favorite, least known capabilities in terms of military analysts. And it's been very interesting to watch the hype of hypersonics over the last 2 or 3 years, talking about how they are invisible or difficult to detect, but only if you don't know about heat detection systems in space. So you have a lot of people who are experts in particular fields, but they haven't looked at or they don't know much about space systems, not realizing that hypersonics can generate a lot of heat, and various space systems can pick up things that are much, much cooler than the immense heat given off by things in hypersonic flight in the atmosphere. So those systems are quite interesting, and also Spears highlights a difficulty in the book as well, where what it tried to do was put together a lot of specialist literature and investigations on different countries and technologies into sort of a single synthetic overview or narrative. But a lot of it is still American dominated because it's the US that is most open and transparent about most of the stuff it's done in space, compared to Britain, France, China, India, Japan. So it's been a real challenge to find lots of good non-American examples of things as well. But you'll get to read and find out if I got the balance right or not on non-US examples of things. The final part of the book looks at sort of the hard edge of space power, and where conflict and warfare is more of a concern, especially now that more and more countries are becoming more dependent on space systems. So in the 1990s, it was difficult to avoid discussion of how satellites were now useful in shaping individual battles on Earth. But what was seen in the so-called First Space War of 1991 in the Persian Gulf was really showing the fruits of efforts in the United States from the 1970s and the 80s in developing what's called the tactical application of space power or satellite systems. So you get a lot of experimental technologies being demonstrated in the field in 1991, and it shows the potential of those technologies in the years to come. So GPS was not finished in 1991, but even in its unfinished state, it was tremendously useful, especially for the 7th Corps of the US Army doing the left hook through the west of Iraq through the desert without getting lost most of the time. So these technologies demonstrated lots of potential at the end of the Cold War, but again, showing decades of work and investment in these technologies. And the buzzwords that came about in the 1990s were sensor-to-shooter kill chains or reconnaissance strike complexes. This also fed into wider concepts in military commentary and analysis in the United States called the Revolution in Military Affairs, what the Soviet Union referred to as a military technical revolution in the 1980s. Basically, more high-tech equipment to be more precise with precision warfare and enable more networked military forces that could be more efficient and less rigid by using mobile communications, mobile information updates, and more precise weapons technologies. And more countries have become more dependent on these systems since the early 90s. And more countries have built their own systems as well, and their own satellites for military or tactical military purposes as well. So when satellites are useful for wars on Earth, it only increases the rationale for developing various kinds of anti-satellite weapon systems. Satellites become targets when they are useful in wartime. So when people say that anti-satellite weapons are destabilizing, well, they're there for a reason. Rather, isn't the instability the fact that you're using space to make a difference in wars on the ground in the first place? Because if you didn't do that, there wouldn't be a reason to have anti-satellites at all. But that said, anti-satellite weapons have a long history as well. Sputnik was launched in 1957. By 1959, the US said it had a capable nuclear-tipped anti-satellite missile system ready. So, very quick, not wasting any time there. So it's a bit reminiscent of how quickly air defense systems came about after the first successful power flight, especially in Britain after the French managed to cross the channel with their neighbours. So anti-satellite weapons have a very long history, like many space technologies. And what this really means as well is that space warfare is really just another type of warfare, like land, maritime, and aerial warfare. It's not really politically or strategically special. It's just in another place. It just has no atmosphere. But in terms of its political effects or strategic significance, we can analyze it and think about it in the same way as we do with war in general. And more specifically, Earth orbit mostly resembles a coastal or a littoral proximate environment, because the satellites are only relevant in terms of what they do for services on the ground and their impact for what goes on Earth, not necessarily for the space environment itself. And for me, the ultimate high ground is really a statement about good positioning. It is not a winning strategy. For me, thinking about a coastline allows more flexible thinking through different possibilities of what war in space could look like. Whereas the ultimate high ground falls into the trap of thinking what you need is a good position and everything else will follow. Karl von Clausewitz, a Prussian military theorist from the early 19th century, was struggling with people who thought the same in his time, thinking all you need in a good strategy is to find the keys to a country, the domineering heights, the commanding heights, if you will. Whereas he was saying, no, what you need is effective combat at the right places at the right time with the right political strategy to lead it. And that can take any number of forms. So the position is a means to an end. It's not the end in itself in terms of strategy. So I go into more detail on that, and I basically say that the ultimate high ground is quite a banal statement. Of course you want a good position, but that doesn't mean you're going to win the war. You know, the French found that out in 1870 against the Prussians quite dramatically. Their good positions in eastern France didn't really count for much against much more effective Prussian maneuvers. One of my favorite examples of old weapons technology is the IS or the NARIAD system, the NARIAD being the more mature second generation, and it's what is called a co-orbital kinetic ASAT. And I find it interesting that a lot of proponents of space-based weapons would think that the world's going to end if, or we're going to have a World War III if a country weaponizes space. They don't seem to want to talk or think about those times when space was sort of weaponized in the past, when weapons were placed in space and ultimately was rolled back. The weapons, the genie was put back in its box. So these weapon systems were sort of developed and intermittently deployed through the 70s and into the 1990s. And the Soviet Union did not really develop many of these systems. It was more about mastering a certain capability and perhaps hedging a technological capability, in part, but not completely driven by the developments in the Star Wars program, although I know Aaron is more the expert on STI, so I won't say much more about Star Wars because I'll just get corrected. But in part in response to American STI efforts, but these systems predate STI as well. But these systems may come back in future or may not, depending if they might be able to threaten certain satellites in certain ways between different countries as well. So, but of course, kinetic anti-satellite weapon systems are not the only kinds of weapon systems that you can use against satellites. If we're going to see space warfare happen between big countries tomorrow, we'll see a lot of electronic warfare or radio jamming and cyber intrusions or computer network attacks and computer network operations as well. But they are far harder for us in the public sphere to measure, to identify, and to assess as well. Those are far more difficult to keep a track of than big physical systems like kinetic anti-satellite weapon systems. But for anyone interested in kinetic anti-satellite systems, looking at how and why various Soviet systems came and went is particularly instructive, and I wish more people would look at it. Because some people think that you know, the answer to most things is a space-based interceptor program, and you know, they're very, very expensive, and some countries have looked at it and decided it's not worth it. So looking at a bit more, having a broader scope of global space weapons histories be useful. So, you know, the fractional orbital bombardment system, the space-based nuclear weapons system that the Soviet Union sort of half tested and deployed in the 60s and 70s, became obsolete once they had nuclear parity in submarines and missiles for the Americans. Also, China considered doing a FOBS in the 1960s as well and decided totally not worth it for particular reasons. So just because certain things can be built, it doesn't mean that they should be or is the best use of limited resources, even for the superpowers who have the most resources. And in the final chapter of the book as well, I tried to make a case for, again, normalizing space warfare in terms of the way it's analyzed by military and sort of national security practitioners, because often the language of deterrence dominates what I would call, warfare analysis or war studies. Deterrence is quite a narrow subject, and deterrence is not the same as warfare. Deterrence is trying to stop someone from doing something. It's a more political, psychological concept. It's not really war. It's not doing war. It's not planning wars. It's not war fighting, as is the current jargon. So deterrence is quite a narrow concept, and it's really focused on political communication and creating certain psychological effects on individuals. But the idea of space warfare isn't normalized in the way that land warfare, aerial warfare, maritime warfare, and perhaps cyber warfare is normalized in a lot of military analysis. A lot of thinking on space is still subsumed by nuclear deterrence thinking or missile defense thinking, which is not accurate. Because military forces are still there to fight wars, not just to deter them. Bernard Brodie doesn't like that, of course. But military forces are there to do practical things, not just to deter and hope never to do things. So space weapons, satellite systems, whether they're jamming systems, cyber weapons against satellites, you have to think through how they will be used in every stage of a potential conflict of a war, not just how do you stop that war from happening. They're very different things. I'm not saying that deterrence is not important. It's that it's not war plans. It's not a war plan. It's just how do you stop the war from happening? Well, if deterrence fails, you've got to fight a war then, and you better hope that the military's actually thought about it. So there needs to be more explicit focus on warfare as opposed to deterrence for military analysis. So there's a lot of literature out there that uses quite bland and sterile deterrence language to the detriment of space warfare analysis and education. And this is quite a problem in a lot of public sort of speaking events and panels. There's a lot of intellectual dishonesty when space warfare is actually the topic, but everyone uses the language of deterrence. Herman Kahn, trying to explain the reason you have to think about fighting a nuclear war is it's irresponsible to just want to possess weapons and then not think through how you would actually use them. Because if you don't have a credible plan to actually use them, then you actually undermine any deterrent value you might get from it. So you have to think through every step of a potential war and then work back from there to get to the potential deterrent effects that we want. So I think to get a better idea of how space contributes to deterrence, you have to think about space warfare and work back from there. So getting to the end, you'll be glad to hear. We're reaching the 45-minute mark, I think. At the end of the book, I try to sort of zoom out from the purely military stuff and look at the international system and the global space age. And space is not remarkable. Space is just, or space warfare, space politics is just a continuation of terrestrial politics by other means. And the analysis of power, or the distribution of power, or the way we look at global governance on Earth, all those concepts and the way we do things are still useful for us to study what goes on in outer space, no matter what aspect of space, and especially space governance or space security that you might be interested in. Because the global space age has not overcome the forces of international anarchy. So if any of you are international relations scholars and you're doing buzzword bingo, you're going to be busy here. So international anarchy, for those of you not familiar with IR theory, is the idea that there is no supreme authority or effective authority above that of the most powerful states in the system. And these states are also nuclear armed as well, and they can end everything. So it's an anarchic system. It doesn't mean there's no order. There can be order, but it's an order amongst similar units. And space is not apart from this. It's an outgrowth of it. Space politics is an outgrowth of that. And we're seeing whatever we think of as world order, we can see it manifesting in outer space as well in the way things are done there. And I think it's important to stress as well that the space age really was not the result of an inevitable force of technological progress. It was the result of successive choices by many people in the chaotic political and social universe that we live in. There's nothing inevitable about any of the things I cover in the book. It is what has happened, but there was nothing inevitable about it. There's a lot of there's a particular problem in political science that views technology and history as sort of a linear path of progress or technological capability or improving living standards, which is not the case. It's a far more complex political and social universe, and technology is not a force that is separate from humans. Technology is a product of humans, ultimately. Now, technologies can impose its effects on people, but often through the design of other people. So Daniel McCarthy, a good IR scholar on technology and international relations and politics, says that the problem with humanity and technology is not that it is outside of the control of human agency, is that it is outside the control of some humans' agencies. Is that specific people develop these technologies for their own specific interests, which are not always for the benefit of everyone. And that includes space and space technology. So space is not special in terms of technopolitics, the politics of technology. And sadly, such as in the work of Daniel Durdney, Dark Skies, which is a very great book. I recommend you read it if you haven't already. We don't really need to theorize a distant future to see some dystopian sort of space civilization, because in some ways we're already there. Many of the problems and the injustices that we can see in the world are just happening in space as well, or they are exacerbating things on Earth through sort of squandering scarce resources for selfish gains. And we also don't need to wait for the madness of Martian libertarians, for horrible people to be doing horrible things to each other. Whether it's Robert Zubrin or Total Recall. It's like there's plenty of horrible things happening with space technology right now. Because the questions of power, politics, who has what, who controls what technology are very live issues right now. But if we want to make things better, we have to accept the realities of original sin, the space technology, and the political nature of all space activities. So on the plus side, space cooperation doesn't happen in spite of politics. It is politics. Everything in space is politics. So I get quite annoyed when people say, oh, well, can't we just have space cooperation and forget the politics? No, that is politics. Why different countries cooperate and on what terms is a political thing. The International Space Station was a product of geopolitical bargaining. Getting Russia onto the missile technology control regime, preventing it from selling cryogenic engine technology to India, for example, stopping Russian engineers from getting work in other parts of the world that might have had the money to pay for Russian rocket expertise and missile programs. So cooperation in space is still political and complicated as the more nasty aspects of human politics. So very final thoughts. So if there's one thing you take from this, and tell other people, please, just that meme, share that meme, please. Because I think it sums up most of my frustration with the way many people talk about space. But in terms of the larger themes, really, that in the book, and in keeping with the larger arguments of the book, a lot of what is in space is not new. And I'm not the first to say that, there are bad things happening in space, or what's going on in space is politically business as usual. So Herbert Marcuse, was very alive to the fact that the space age came from totalitarian regimes' technological advances. The ghost of Auschwitz is there in the achievements of spaceflight. And French political theorist Raymond Aron, he said that short of a revolution in the heart of man and the nature of states, well, by what miracle could interplanetary space be preserved from military use? Now, of course, interplanetary space is not militarized yet because there's nothing of military or economic significance there. The moon is not there yet either, and probably will not be in my lifetime. But Earth orbit below 40,000 kilometers is, of course, economically and militarily significant, and therefore heavily militarized. But what goes on in space is as political as what happens on Earth. I'm repeating myself already, which is a sign I've talked for long enough. And also, I know that either in this presentation or in reading aspects of the book, or some people might quote me in isolation on Twitter, which is great publicity either way, really. But I'm not arguing to defund space just because there are bad things in space. We should stop doing space things, or that you can't enjoy the things that you like about space. By all means, enjoy the images coming from James Webb Space Telescope. enjoy, supports the space activities you think are meaningful and doing a positive difference. What I'm arguing is, if you want to understand human activity in space on the larger level, you cannot ignore the negative, the political, the militarized aspects of space as well, and putting that in this larger context. And really, if you want to make space, be for the benefit of all humanity, as the universal spirit of the Outer Space Treaty says, it begins with recognizing the injustices inflicted on marginalized peoples and the power politics of space activities. If you cannot grasp the power politics of space, you can't really start changing things for the better. And that is a bit of a hallmark in terms of the more radical nature of many classical realist scholars, such as Hans Morgenthau, E.H. Carr, and other proponents of classic realpolitik as well. So I will leave that there. Thank you so much for your rapt attention. I hope you got something out of that, and I look forward to the questions. Thank you. Yeah, I think we're doing microphones for the benefit of the Zoom audience.
Thanks so much for that. Sort of projecting ahead a little bit, could you talk about the impact of commercial space and non-state actors having quite a bit of control in this realm? I mean, thinking obviously of Starlink and its impact in Ukraine, but satellites being able to take pictures for people who pay, anything like that, it kind of obviously changes the landscape. So would love your thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, good question. So and that's one thing I haven't really spoken about in this presentation. The commercial space aspect. Outside the United States, it's very difficult to talk of any significant commercial space activity, really. And even then, before the last sort of 10, 15 years, even then the United States was relatively small, especially if you discount government spending on things. So even today, what we can call commercial space, especially in the United States, a lot of the companies are chasing government contracts. So whilst there are private space companies, I would disagree with this as more of an expert on the economics than me. At least my perception is that so much of what goes on in space is driven by government spending on a global level in one way or another. And you see that in the business model with SpaceX. The launch program was there to break ULA's monopoly and try and become the new monopoly, ideally, of course, from SpaceX's perspective, for the US government as the preferred launch provider. Of course, US policy disagreed with that. Chasing government contracts is still very important for what a commercial space sector. But in terms of then the more acute sort of operational stuff, such as Starlink in Ukraine, when you have important assets in commercial or private hands, the government is still influential, I think, in regulating those activities and also encouraging them to behave in ways that suit the foreign and security policies of the states that they are registered within. So what's happened with Starlink really, I think, is a continuation of things we've seen before in terms of the role of commercial or private assets in space being so useful in military or security or foreign policy activities. And the example of Spot in the 1991 Gulf War, for example, there were many concerns, not necessarily before, but there was a lot of commentary in military literature in the 1990s about what if more things like Spot exist, the French civil commercial mapping satellites. What if more things like them existed in future that are not American companies, but are foreign companies, and they could sell to the highest bidder of the market? And what the Americans did, of course, was use their diplomatic leverage to convince them not to sell, but also to buy up everything they produced as well. So there are many options for controlling commercial actors as well. And also, if there are very wealthy individuals in a particular country that go against critical security, foreign policy interests of the state they are either citizens in or their business is registered in, there are many enforcement measures a state can take with problematic companies. I think especially if the political stakes are high enough. So yeah, so I still see that the state is still very influential, even with the biggest sort of commercial entities in space, I think. And also, if the US government is your biggest customer, you don't want to lobby them too much, especially if there are other potential providers around the corner with alternatives as well. So I hope that at least gives you my perspective. That's great. Thank you. Thank you. There's a hand up, I think. And then we'll move to. Oh, we're doing.
Hello. How do you see the international cooperation when it comes to the implementation of space situational awareness and any possible obstacles that stand in the way of achieving effect SSA?
Really good question. If I had a good answer to that, I'd be very lucky man. Yeah, I mean, that's a really difficult question. I think one of the obstacles is that it's space situation awareness or space domain awareness, as some militaries like to call it now. It has been a very militarized thing and also a very a sensitive thing for intelligence communities as well. So there's a culture of classification and sensitivity about what certain satellites are doing and how much transparency certain governments are comfortable with. So I think in some countries, especially the older space powers, they're just used to not sharing that information and being very sensitive about what information is out there about the satellite. So I think there's sort of political bureaucratic cultures that might be holding things back. But as we've seen in the United States, however, things are being moved from the DoD to commerce bit by bit. So things, if you're interested in more transparency and the civilianization of specific kinds of space infrastructure, that is moving in the right direction, really. But it's the United States is quite a paradox in this because it's had the biggest catalogue of orbital data, for a very long time. So it's hidden the most, but it's also shared the most with everyone else as well. And I don't think the United States gets enough recognition in terms of being the good citizen in space by telling the Chinese when one of their satellites is getting a little bit close to a piece of debris from one of their own anti-satellite weapons tests from many years before. So yeah, it's a very complicated picture, but I think with increasing a higher number of countries more involved in space, there's only going to be more clamour for more open data on it, especially when more countries are developing sensors that are beyond the direct control of the more established space powers as well. And we're seeing, non-state actors sharing data with the Space Data Association as well. So I think things are moving in terms of more transparency, and as more companies and governments want better insurance deals for their satellites, and a more predictable environment needs more transparent data. So I think that's a direction of travel, but yeah, I think it's very much a policy challenge. It's not a technical challenge, but maybe there are technical people here who would disagree with that. There's a lady.
Thanks, Dr. Bowen, for the talk. My question is a little bit of a two-parter. You spoke about how we need to move beyond deterrence, and there has been intellectual dishonesty about the way we think about space that already has military and political history. So one, do you think the United States is uniquely vulnerable just because of the extent of networks and systems we have in space vis-a-vis other countries? And second, do you think that in turn complicates the possibility of thinking in terms of doctrine about military space beyond deterrence, while at the same time not signaling any sort of intent to our adversaries that we plan to take a more aggressive step?
Yeah, two very difficult questions. So I'll take the second one first. So no, I'll take the first one actually. So in terms of US vulnerability, it is very difficult to talk about in very general terms in terms of how dependent or how vulnerable is the United States in space. I think you have to look at specific space infrastructure and satellite constellations. So if you look at satellite communications, the US military and government has access to a massive array of different kinds of satellites, civil and military as well. There's a lot of depth and variety in satellite communications for the US government, these days in particular. But if you look at the infrared sensors, there's not a lot of those satellites. So you could potentially target efforts against those, not saying, there's an obvious reason to do that, depending on the situation, but because there's not many of those satellites, it's more feasible to start sort of taking out that capability. But as we saw, Congress is now pushing the Space Force to develop a more distributed low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit infrastructure in response to that. So I guess I'm a bit more blasé about American vulnerabilities because I look at the United States and it's got more than everyone else. So I don't think, there are particular vulnerabilities, but even with the large constellations, if your cybersecurity is pretty bad or you haven't addressed electronic warfare, you can still take measures against even distributed systems then. So distributed systems and the silver bullet, you still have to make sure that there's no single point of failure, in a piece of coding where if you take out a single piece of coding in the software, the whole thing falls apart. So there are still issues there beyond the physical realm. Your second question, I've got a love-hate relationship with doctrine, really. One, you get a bit of insight into the way a military service thinks about itself, what it wants to do and how it wants to portray itself. But then nobody really reads doctrine. So then I'm like, I don't want to spend too much time. But you do need specialized people to be able to understand that language, because if and when large-scale hostilities do happen in space, there are going to be people who are going to be blowing off the dust on those documents. So you need them to be there to be good. But yeah, I'll start rambling if I get too on doctrine, because there's a lot to say about doctrine. Topic that nobody really cares about outside of the military, really, and very specific parts of the government bureaucracy. But yeah, I think it has to. I think deterrence gets in the way of space warfare thinking when reading some literature in the IR and security studies field, there seems to be more discomfort at the idea of blowing up satellites or disrupting satellite infrastructure than killing people. It's like, who cares about expensive space infrastructure when you might have people dying by the thousands on the ground? If doing something to our space infrastructure, either physically or through electronic warfare, can make a difference to those people on the ground. So I think there has to be more flexible, creative strategic thinking that gets away from the rigidity of deterrence thinking and the 1960s economic style deterrence theory. So I hope that's okay. Thank you. There were many hands up. So Victoria and Scott.
Thank you. I'm curious, you've been here in the US for a couple of days now talking to government folks. How does a discussion of the Nazi beginnings of the US space program go over, given that we still have a lot of Von Braun memorials, symposiums, conferences, and just NASA seems very reluctant to take his name off anything?
I've not particularly raised that element in my previous talks, really, so I can't say how it's been received. But I think it's very much a topic. I think that it is not the same, but has similar issues to other historical figures that have memorials and have been lionized in certain histories when they're very problematic figures, very complex histories, and nuanced political meanings for today. So so beyond that, I don't feel particularly qualified to comment on American culture and the remembrance of Von Braun as well. But I think it is a particular focal point for perhaps the way the origin of the space age is remembered in the United States. But also that is not uniquely American either. Wernher von Braun is unique in becoming so dominant in the Apollo program and in NASA's history, but the influence of Nazi scientists and the advancements of their technologies were felt in many countries as well. So again, it's not necessarily uniquely American, but perhaps it is in terms of von Braun's single influence, but very much part of the wider Nazi heritage. That's actually a very difficult question.
So the question I have regarding back to deterrence, maybe this is more theoretical. In Schelling's coercion theory, he talks about deterrence, but then he talks about compellence. And so deterrence in the nuclear world is all about, we'll stop doing something bad. But at what point in space do we need to start thinking about compelling behaviors, not just enforcement, but compellence, or because that's much harder to do? Does it have a place? What are the areas where we might see thinking about compellence as opposed to just deterrence?
Well, wherever you want it, actually. I mean, compellence is, well, is such a universal concept, and you know, some would say that there is no deterrence, there is only compellence. So again, it depends how you define the concept, but yeah, I mean, you can use certain levers to get the behavior that you want. That's common political practice. So, you know, in a crisis, if you want a country to do something differently, then you just find the right tools at a time. And I struggle with the big ideas of deterrence and compellence beyond their very core meanings, because they can be applied in so many different ways, in so many different situations. And the way you do it matters to the situation at hand. Really, same with you know, Clausewitz's concept of general friction. It's like, you know, you're not going to get anything out of that theory in terms of telling you how is this thing going to go wrong tomorrow. It's, you just have to know things are going to go wrong and you have to do something about it. So you have to know that you need carrots as well as sticks when dealing with people and countries, and it's up to practitioners to develop the appropriate compellence tools to the situation at hand. And you know, it's not necessarily restricted to space either. So when we talk about, you know, I don't like talking about space deterrence, because you know, if you want to deter someone, you just do deterrence. Space is part of that. You're not going to do space deterrence. So in the same way with compellence, it's like somebody does something you don't like in space, well, you can find any form of compellence to get the result you want in other domains if you want. I hope that's a satisfactory. Yes.
Two quick things. In the beginning, of course, you tried to pat down the importance of the United States to a global environment, and I don't doubt that your examples, except in your book, when you're thinking, when you look at the money spent, it's dominant. It's been dominant from the beginning, and a lot in the early days of encouraging through joint foreign aid, really, developments in other nations and scientists in other nations can be traced back to the United States as well. So I think there's a counter argument there about the importance. On another topic, though, also, when you talk about benefits, you'll actually look at the space treaties. Benefits, it's a little bit vague, because in some cases it talks about benefits to all peoples. But for the most part, the treaties are agreements among governments, and specifically in many parts talks about benefits to nations or countries without a good definition of benefits. So that could be interpreted in many ways, national security as well as peaceful civilian purposes. And then just associated with that, weapons are not prohibited, specifically in the treaties. Nuclear weapons put into orbit on celestial bodies are. That's it.
Yeah, thank you. So on your first point, yeah, in terms of the US, yeah, I wouldn't disagree that yeah, the US is the biggest space power. And you know, even you know, in the 1970s, 1980s, the US developed a wider range of space infrastructure and capabilities, and to a level that the Soviets did not. But I've read enough books about US space history. So it's trying to provide that perspective from, you know, the smaller powers, the different powers, and just because the US, and you know, also, you know, the 1990s, absolutely the US is dominant. You know, depending where you draw the measuring stick, you know, at some point in the 2010s, you know, it was still dominant. Really, and I mean, if you want to look at anything we could call a private space economy, yes, the US is still dominant there. But I don't think that understanding the world can be done by just looking at the dominant powers. Exactly. So yeah, absolutely take the point of that. I'm not saying the US is not the biggest or the most capable. It's that there's more to space than the United States. So that's sort of what I was trying to do. Not to say the US is not important, but we need to look beyond the United States, and that's where a lot of the existing literature and also declassified information is. So, credit to the United States for being the most transparent. I wish other, especially Western countries, would follow their suit. On the second point, absolutely. And international law is developed for many different reasons to satisfy many different stakeholders. But I think many people hang on to the aspirational language of the Outer Space Treaty without looking enough at the practical thinking behind it and the way things are phrased in certain ways as well.
So if you're looking at the Space Force from Western Europe, let's say the Space Force called you and asked for your advice, what would be your top recommendations in terms of what the Space Force's priorities should be? Part one, and part two is what would be your top recommendation for how the Space Force communicates its mission to the general public?
Oh, two difficult and very large questions there. We haven't got enough time for me to say everything I want to say on those two subjects, but on the first one, US Space Force priorities. I think as a young service, it's got a lot to do, but it's inherited a very large space infrastructure from the US Air Force. And the biggest, the everyday activities that it does now is really about keeping that infrastructure going, being that logistical enabling support to the other military services and the US government as necessary on the ground. If you take away the space infrastructure uses of space, you lose the rationale for, having a war in space to begin with. So I think that, the primary mission for the Space Force really is now is to keep that infrastructure going and modernize effectively. But that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be space weapons or anti-satellite developments either, particularly when now Russia, China, perhaps other countries are putting up targets for hitting for the US military. But the US military as a whole is going to have a very, very bad day if it loses its very good space infrastructure as well. So managing that space infrastructure, protecting it, but also then afterwards deciding to deny the use of similar space infrastructure by other potentially hostile countries, especially in a time of war, or exclusively in a time of war, because in a time of peace, the Space Force should not be doing anything to other countries' space systems. So the logistical element is where I would want to see a lot of emphasis in the US Space Force communications. It's also what allies are most interested in as well, because the US military basically provides most of the space infrastructure for its allied military forces. And not that the Space Force is doing this necessarily, but there's a lot of commentary in the public sphere that focuses on very exotic space weapons capabilities or fawning over, Chinese orbital bombardment system, getting distracted by, very marginal exotic things and not focusing on perhaps the real infrastructure that different countries are building in space, not least China. And unfortunately, you get some commentary on the cislunar environment, and they're getting distracted by the very real issues that are happening in Earth orbit below 40,000 kilometers. The moon is 10 times further away. Nothing of military or economic significance is happening on the moon, and probably won't for the rest of my life. I'll be amazed if I see something like McMurdo Station on the moon before I die. And I don't plan to die tomorrow. Famous last words. So there's been some cislunar talk or like lunar monitoring missions for the Space Force. I think that's a distraction. Like, leave that to NASA, leave that to the civil agencies, because they're just scientific robots. I mean, who is really terrified of a robot on the far side of the moon from China carrying nothing more dangerous than a potato? I mean, if that is China capturing the cislunar high ground, then James Cameron is the king of the sea, because he went, deepest down into the ocean on some exploratory vessel, more deep than anyone else had ever gone before. With the nature of that competition on the moon is very different to the military competition that was seen between the US and China in Earth orbit. So I'd like to see less moon talk from the Space Force and more about the infrastructure in Earth orbit and the protection of that and the denial of similar infrastructure to potential adversaries as well. So I hope that answers your two big questions. Is that hard to cut off at 6:30?
I'm sorry. Thank you. My question actually has to do with what you just mentioned. Do you reckon that this focus on sort of unrealistic space weapons or focus on cislunar activity is in part done on purpose to sort of detract attention from certain counter space technologies that are either more commonly used or kind of like, you know, that they want to keep it under wraps, so to say, in order to be able to continue to use them or to develop them?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I've seen nothing to suggest that. I think when many people earnestly believe in having more military interests on the moon, I think there are people who make those arguments are doing it in good faith. I don't think it's a sort. But who knows, in 30 years when archives start releasing these things, I might be proven wrong on that. But no, I don't think so. You know, but then there's enough going on in terms of meaningful anti-satellite weapons development, such as radio jamming and, you know, various kinetic systems, that I don't know why you'd want to hide that anyway in terms of other weapons development. So, you know, obviously you don't reveal specifics, but in terms of the principle of we're developing this kind of weapons program or close inspection systems, a lot is sort of already known, really. So yeah, I don't see the cislunar thing as a sponsor. There's a hand up in the back there, the grey jackets. You had a hand up. And then there's some questions coming from the far left. Sorry, there's a lady, oh sorry, behind you.
So in one sense, to me, space is just another domain, you know, like air, maritime, land. Are there, and so I don't know why on one hand we would expect things to be dramatically different in the space domain over time than we would in these more traditional domains. But are there lessons learned that you think we can apply to the space domain so that it doesn't evolve maybe to the natural state of potential conflict that we've seen in these domains with which we're more familiar?
Thanks, good question. So in a lot of the academic literature and also some professional literature, there is sometimes a distinction made with space as a sort of, you know, a holy place or a sanctuary from violence, when it just really hasn't been true, because if a major conflict was to happen, then even in the middle of the Cold War, weapons fire could be directed into space. And a lot of the weaponization literature in the security studies field tends to give a sort of a threshold quality to putting weapons in space and seeing space as a currently pristine environment, which, you know, it isn't. So a lot of people do see space as a different place where war doesn't currently belong there and shouldn't belong there as well. So my point on it being the same as Earth is as a response to a lot of that literature that argues that, you know, space is a special place that, you know, war has no place for. Well, sadly, it already does. In terms of lessons learned, I think, especially in terms of space governance, I mean, you're not going to prevent the militarization of space. It's not being militarized. But in terms of not making things worse or exacerbating tensions between different countries, and remembering that what happens in space is an outgrowth of terrestrial politics, is not something that happens separately to it. There's a lot that can be learned from aerial and maritime governance in terms of traffic management. Obviously not in the detail, because the physical environment is very different and the legal conventions and all that. But in terms of the general principles of, we should be able to find ways of managing traffic in a way that most countries could be happy with. I think that there are many lessons learned that people who understand the finer details much better than me can then apply to space. And I'm quite tired of the refrain that we're getting in a lot of the NGO and governmental sphere now saying we need more space norms, we need more rules. It's like, yeah, do it then. There's plenty of technical expertise that you can do if you just provide the political capital into doing it. Just get on with it. Really. So I think there are many things you can learn from the aerial and maritime things in terms of lessons learned. You just have to amend them and modify them to the technically and geographically unique aspects of space. There was another hand up here.
I have a question about your theory of space warfare and asymmetric conflict, particularly when you conceive of space, or at least useful space, as like a littoral or coastal zone that is increasingly accessible to the international community. What do you think the prospects of small states like Iran, North Korea, or even Ukraine are for using space to punch up? Or like you mentioned with US space systems, are they just so redundant and resilient that there's not any targets of value?
Yeah, good question. So I addressed this in my first book, War in Space, and yeah, one of the reasons why I liked continental sea power theory to do the space power theory in the first book is that it does look at lesser powers to think about naval warfare and naval strategy, whereas a lot of maritime thinking, at least in the Anglophone world, is dominated by the British and American experiences as dominant naval powers. Well, the continental approach looks at land powers that had smaller navies and that wouldn't invest all their resources into their naval power. So when it comes to space, then that continental and coastal approach shows, yeah, the coast is more accessible to more people, at sea and in space. And coastal defense weapons that point out into the sea, you can do that with space, with Earth-based anti-satellite weapons fire, whether it's radio frequency jamming or more kinetic physical stuff. So yeah, it is more accessible, and there are opportunities for many smaller countries, and there are low barriers of entry to things like electronic warfare. Cuba and Iran have a long history in SATCOM jamming, albeit civilian, which easier targets than military SATCOMs, but military grade electronic warfare is very difficult for us to know about in the public sphere. So even now with the Russian-Ukrainian war, we don't really know what's going on the electromagnetic front there. There are some snippets coming out about Starlink, but we really don't know what's been going on in terms of the electronic warfare dimension there. So it's even harder then to know what's going on in countries that haven't actually done that in a shooting war yet. But there are the opportunities and the potential are there with a country like North Korea, that is a nuclear weapon state now. Not that they necessarily would, but they could just do high altitude nuclear detonations and make a real mess of satellite infrastructure in space. Depending how they do it, yeah, they could cause real problems. I hope there are plans afoot to deal with that if and when it happens. So, so nuclear weapons are a great balance of a small state, and there are real imperatives for small states fearing invasion by other countries to acquire nuclear weapons. Not for all in that situation, but some. So yeah, and this is sort of comes back to Henry's question earlier. This is why it's important to look at smaller powers. And yeah, there are dominant countries, but the actions of smaller powers can have effects that are way out of proportion to their actual size and their actual economic weight if they've made the right investments in particular weapons, technologies, or infrastructure.
My question was with regards to what you mentioned about how you spoke about the lack of rules and norms in space and how we don't anticipate anytime soon, specifically with regards to space debris. Do you think nations are taking the prospects of creating more space debris as space gets more contested as seriously as they should be, specifically commercial actors and non-state actors, where the accountability is one more degree separated? And how do we disincentivize or impose costs on creating debris in space without creating debris in the first place or using ASAT tech or such?
Thanks, yeah, good question. So I guess I disagree with the statement that there are no norms, that there are norms in space. Not all of which many people would like. So the use of space for military purposes is a norm. Everyone's accepted it. You know, most military powers are doing it, using space for military purposes. That is an established norm. It is permitted under international space law. And you can see it in early UN language in the early 1960s. A lot of those sort of early statements and norms eventually made it into the Outer Space Treaty then, which became hard law. So there are norms, and in terms of debris, you know, you have increasing regulation. So the long-term sustainability guidelines, you know, many different countries sort of agreeing that they should do better. You know, enforcement and actually doing it is another thing, but you know, those things are emerging. But importantly, in the United States, you just had the FCC change their satellite disposal rules from 25 years to 5 years. You know, whether it goes far enough is another debate, but you know, it's arguably in the right direction. So I think there's just a lot of scope for unilateralism for many countries to do more in terms of, you know, stop waiting for the perfect multilateral agreement. You won't get it. And what's interesting in the United States in the last few years, it's just gone and done things, and it's done things that actually most countries don't have a problem with. But then it's up to the individual countries to then enforce or commit to the decisions that they've made. So I don't think you need to have any more particular agreements, but rather have countries do the things they signed up to doing, like being more transparent in the UN launch registry. You know, lots of countries aren't very good at doing what they've already said they will do. So it's about persuading or you know, compelling or coercing the countries to do what they've already signed up to, really, and finding the levers for that. So I guess I'm uncharacteristically optimistic on that front. So you know, there are many norms, and but more is happening now on that in the last 3-4 years, 5 years even, than before. And you know, looking at what's happening with the Artemis Accords, you know, set off by the Trump administration, and of course the National Space Council, which was resumed then. You know, you get in that discussions on, you know, emerging lunar governance agreements, and you know, the Artemis Accords won't be something that China's necessarily going to sign up to, but it shows there's going to be lots of countries agree. Yeah, we need to have agreed common approaches of some kind to, you know, if there's going to be a busier lunar environment with more robots carrying potatoes or other garden vegetables going to the moon, then it's absolutely. So yeah, I hope that answers the questions. Just make sure no one you has a hand. No. Well, come to you next.
With the Russia-Ukraine war, we've seen a lot of politicization with the ISS, and with the ISS's upcoming end in the next few years, there might be a concern as to whether we lose space as a common ground of cooperation between the US and its rival states. Do you see that sort of, I guess, like almost like a balkanization of interest into groups of like-minded countries, or do you still see space and civilian space as a common ground for countries to cooperate in low Earth orbit?
That's a difficult question. So, you know, civilian space is, you know, international civil space cooperation is intensely critical. You know, the terms of cooperation are, you know, intensely fought over. I mean, you can look at, you know, the European Space Agency itself, because, you know, the competition for contract resources, responsibilities, is very intense, but it's within agreed rules, and it's a formalized system of bidding and negotiation. But then between the European Space Agency and NASA and the Canadian Space Agency, JAXA, so I see it as an area where you can have common cooperation, but I don't see it as inherently an area of common cooperation. You will have competition within agreed frameworks, and everybody knows that, yeah, we want to get more money and things out of this, or as much as we can get, because everyone wants to develop their high technology sectors, their university sectors, space science capabilities, and just get more foreign direct investment as well. With Russia and the International Space Station, yeah, it's probably won't see that kind of cooperation with Russia again anytime soon. Already, Russia is not part of the lunar gateway. That would be the next big space station thing for the US and its traditional partners, really. But the ISS itself, it's that was a product of geopolitical bargaining, and there were hard security interests involved in that agreement. It wasn't somewhere that you can have just cooperation for the sake of it, but it is an area where you can find less sensitive areas to cooperate, where otherwise you might have quite a difficult relationship with that state. So coordination with China on the moon is an interest for the United States. It doesn't mean cooperating or anything like that, but deconfliction, for example, is important. If America and China are going to be doing more in the space, and make sure you don't unnecessarily annoy each other. Try and have ways of coexisting on the moon, and it's just space science. It's not like you're pointing nukes at each other on the moon. And not anytime soon. So I hope that answers the question. I think one last question. I think
we should probably pick someone else to end on, but I've got a fun one.
Nice way to end that.
So in your research, in the through the lens of history as the most esteemed form of gossip, what's a juicy tidbit that jumped out to you that you were surprised by and perhaps shared with your friends?
That's a curveball. It's a very good question. I don't know. I think this won't be surprising to anyone who's done space history classes here. But I think my favorite sort of quip, unsurprisingly, involves Nikita Khrushchev, where John F. Kennedy proposed a joint, Apollo, a joint lunar crewed return mission, and John F. Kennedy made that proposal, and I think it was one of their meetings in Geneva. Khrushchev said, "Sure, let's work together on a crewed lunar landing. I'll send a man to the moon. You bring him back." So that's for me is like one of my favorite sort of little quips and anecdotes. But yeah, those of you who've read your John Logston will know that very well. So yeah, thank you. That was a nice question to end. So I guess we'll end it there, and thank you all very much for the questions and discussion. Thank you.